2020 was a pretty contentious year, pretty whirlwind year out here in the wider verse, and also within the tabletop role-playing hobby. You may recall online seeing a lot of contentious conversations. Some folks were looking for some changes to be made in the culture of play, in the rules, in the mythology around Dungeons and Dragons. They felt there were some changes long overdue to make the game more inclusive. And I made a few videos about some of those controversies, which you can watch, but this video is not about that. It's about something which is neither new, not a change, and frankly, I'm kind of flabbergasted how it's much of a controversy as it stands right now. I'm talking about elevators in dungeons. Yeah, it seems like something that's been around since the 70s, since some of the earliest and most revered dungeon designs. It's a canonical part, as far as I recall, of places like Castle Greyhawk, if not Castle Greyhawk itself. How could this have happened? Let me walk you through the controversy first, and then we'll have some fun talking about what it means to have an elevator in the dungeon, what kind of technologies can power it, and if you're still around, what it means to construct dungeons with vertical elements, with multiple layers. If that's your sort of thing, my name is sometimes Antoine, but I'm always the complex games apologist. Let's get into it. So to walk you through the controversy, as I understand it, and as I've beheld it in places in the internet where controversies are had, it seems that some folks, celebrity dungeon masters included, are very proud of some adventure modules, some dungeons that they've prepared for large audiences to behold their player character party exploring, are very proud of some inclusivity architecture, which is part of those dungeon designs, i.e. elevators, ramps, and so on. And the logic that informed the inclusion of those elements is pretty much grounded in being inclusive. I think that that's a debate about whether the dungeon should be the dungeon, whether evil guys in the world really are keeping in mind how to be accessible. There might be elevators for reasons, freight, for getting a lot of miners down deep into the earth, but usually sinister elements in Dungeons and Dragons worlds are maybe not super concerned with these things. So it comes down to the dungeon master sort of revising the world to make it more comfortable for their friends, for the people they're playing with. And I think that that's a valid perspective. I also think that sort of letting the challenges and the internal logic of the world be its own self as a source of adversity, which player characters are well equipped to overcome with all of their abilities, and with things like the combat wheelchair, which I feel are well within the scope of the power level of first level 5th edition player characters, at the very least. But, the obstacles out there might just be the way they are. I think that let the world be the world, make your friends comfortable, make the environment as accommodating as possible. Those two perspectives, they're hard to reconcile with one another, but I see validity in both of them, and I'm not necessarily sure that we have to fight between these two. As long as you, as a human being, are trying to be welcoming, you're not trying to torture or gotcha the people that you play with for the simple act of choosing to play a character that shares some parts of their own identity. But this video is not about that. Like I said at the beginning, the first thing I want to do is reject the very idea that there's anything out of place, new, disruptive to elevators in the dungeon. First, it's a high fantasy world. For the last 30 years or so, the dominant two campaign settings, the ones that are most revered and most remembered, have been the Forgotten Realms and Eberron, chiefly. There have been others, and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but these are the two that have been most widely supported, the ones that have had the biggest impact in shifting what the imagined, assumed setting is. Suffice it to say, in both of them, there's a lot of magitech technology. There's a ton of anachronistic things. Some of them have been around for a really long time, here on Earth in the canon of those settings. The printing press has been canonical in the Forgotten Realms for a very long time. The cities are incredibly massive, would require really advanced sewer systems, the likes of which we didn't see here on Earth until the 1700s and 1800s at the very least. And that comes with also food distribution infrastructure to keep 1 million people in Waterdeep fed. It's the sort of thing that they just didn't have in the Middle Ages. So if you move your chronological imagining forward, it's completely feasible to see some mechanical elevator designs completely within reach, considering that all these other things are completely within reach in the assumed setting. Notwithstanding that, there's also just the high fantasy idea that there's levitation magical elevators, which are pretty available and often installed for practical reasons. Sharn, the City of Towers, which is sort of the iconic location in the world of Eberron, has elevators. And it has aerial boats. It's a fantasy take on Star Wars Coruscant in many respects. Of course, it's not a planet-wide city, but it does have a lot of vertical space. We're going to talk about what vertical space means in dungeons at the end of this video, so stay tuned. Suffice it to say, I don't think that there's anything terribly disruptive about a mechanical, technological elevator, nor a magical one in the current mainline D&D. There are other D&Ds, some of them are called Pathfinder, some of them are called 13th Age, some of them are called Old School Essentials, and I love them all. Or just speaking to sort of where the culture of play is in the kind of official version, but they're all D&Ds. And I think that we should embrace the idea that there is diversity in D&D. Some of them are more medieval and less magical than others. An elevator in a dungeon. How does that going to work? What kind of mechanical operation could that be if it's before the modern day time? Well, one of them is you can have a water wheel that picks up water on one side and lifts people up on the other side. It can be as simple as a block and tackle with some pulleys that you pull yourself up on a platform. This could involve some wobbling. We'll get to some of the interesting twists involved in including elevators and what the mechanics of the elevator does to the adventure on the little tactical scale in a little bit. It could be something like an Archimedean screw, which drains a cistern, and then this cranks a shaft to put things up. It could be something like a mechanical creature, a construct, which pushes on a capstan. I've got some cool ideas for that I'll share with you in a little bit. And all of these can represent how things go up and down. Having acknowledged that I don't think there's anything all that disruptive, there's plenty of reasons to include these elevators in some dungeon environments for some reasons. Freightage, moving heavy goods up and down, a lot of vertical space. A smuggler's base at a cliffside against the sea certainly needs to lift things up to the level of the plateau in order to get the smuggler's goods out of there. And a mine needs to move all of the miners quickly down into the active shafts at the beginning of the day and get them back out of it again at the end of the day for their families so that they actually get rested and come back and do more work the next day. Some examples of why a mechanical elevator in a dungeon environment would be present. So let's just tie that one up with a bow and say, you're wrong. There's nothing disruptive or all that unusual about an elevator in a dungeon. Just think for a second. Give these people a break, at least on that one. So let's move on to what it means to have an elevator separating vertical areas in a dungeon, as opposed to a stairs, as opposed to a ladder going down a shaft. Suffice it to say, what's the difference? The first thing that I want to point out is that elevators are blind. You can't see what's on the floor below. You can't see what's on your destination floor conventionally. You get in the car, you ride in the car, trusting that it's taking you to a place which you have in mind, or possibly you could be going anywhere just to see where else that you could go. And the door opens, and you can often be surprised by what you see there. Any of us that have decided to casually explore a building, pushing buttons on an elevator and getting off on floors that, we may or may not supposed to be exploring, may have made discoveries or even been shooed back into the elevator car. Now imagine that in the context of a dungeon where there could be perilous monsters. This is the first thing, is that the party is really taking a big risk. Getting into the elevator car, going down, walking out, and possibly the elevator car might close, it might leave them, or it might even be a one-way car that only goes down until some action is taken to rearm it to go back up. There could be a different location that resets the valves, or you might even need to wind it up yourself at the bottom. Suffice it to say, now that you're at the bottom, if you need to run away, if you need to get back to some other area in the dungeon, it's a much more involved process, and it's possibly not a quiet one. All of these data points are going to be whirling around in the player character party's head. They're going to be considering some of these dangers, or at least some people will. And a lot of them will say, oh, I don't know, I don't think we should get in that elevator. Can we look for another way? Some of them will say, what if we just send the car down and then we will climb down the shaft and then we'll hack through the floor of the roof of it and so on. These are thoughts that people will have. They'll try and be more subtle because elevators, in our experience, are not discreet. Contrast stairs, besides in some wooden houses like my own, are often something that people can move with relative stealth down. You do kind of give away that you're coming with your feet long before you can see what's down at the bottom. But you have some clues. You can listen. You can send a cat or rat familiar just ahead of you to get some visual clues. After all, he's down right there by the nap of the earth and can see much more of what's down there than you could. It's just a lot easier for a stealthy character to scout ahead with a set of stairs and to go and have a look, which could include the use of an invisibility spell to be extra safe. These options, many of them are closed off or become considerably more perilous with the elevator. So if there's danger waiting at the bottom, if there's kind of any chance that a combat or an encounter will be activated at the bottom by a split party situation, these things are going to be considered, and they're things for you to consider as you're kind of creating the location of the elevator. Now, one answer is to set up the elevator in the dungeon as a kind of a mall courtyard, or there are often elevators which overlook the exterior of a skyscraper, and you can go on a scenic ride to the top of a skyscraper, looking out at the vista of the city. There's a number of different ways to go about this. Many of us are familiar with the mining elevator that's in the form of a cage, or construction elevators that go up buildings which are not completed. These are ways to see where you are headed, be it up or down. Going to get a little bit more complicated with a lot of these environments that have more 3D space. Say you're going down into a courtyard. The geometry of those things gets considerably harder to describe. It can be hard to even draw on a 2D grid map. And there will be misunderstandings as you describe them, or even if you're using a map. Someone will be looking at the map and they'll get a slightly different idea. They'll talk about how they're very surprised that a monster could have been hiding there. And then you say, no, it was like this. And he was behind the hill. And he was underneath of an alcove right there. These are the sorts of things which take up session time and can be unexpected surprises as we work to kind of plug this information gap that separates the elevator from the stairs. So let's talk about ramps. It's my understanding that inclines cannot be particularly steep to be useful or even human climbable. I've done a little bit of attempted rock climbing in Utah myself, and it seems like about 30 degrees you start making something which resembles a climb check on an incline. 15 degrees is pretty unpleasant climb for most people, unless it's a really well improved trail. You're really looking at like a 10-degree grade to see something which it would be what we would think of as accessible. I'm going to go look this up, and I'll put on the screen what the actual number is as far as like regulations in real life. But suffice it to say, these inclines, they're going to take up a lot of horizontal space. They go on a very long ways. With that in mind, does the party go down them, kind of trusting that nothing will roll down behind them? It kind of leads me to start asking questions of like, how much of the culture of play includes things like traps still. Because these elements, they carry more worry about whether it's not going to go well. Even just a simple act of a grease spell as you're going down an incline could lead to unpleasant circumstances. Could be tumbling and try and get your footing. You may take actual damage, or you could possibly roll off the side of an incline unless there's a railing. These are things that come to mind that I might worry about if I was a player character exploring an environment. Details that will arise and people will ask questions about. So I think there's a lot of unanticipated complexities. There's a lot of wrinkles to elevators and ramps that make them into perilous possible obstacles, or at least ones that may not be trusted as a sure shot. And with the thought of making them into inclusivity architecture, if people don't trust them, or if there are perils to employing them, then this could end up not accomplishing its goal, aka backfiring. Okay, let's get on with it to perhaps the most exciting part of the video for me, and the part that I've saved the best for last, which is, why are you including layers, vertical stacking elements in your dungeons at all? Why did you do this in the first place? No reason? I gotta give you credit, most dungeon masters. So let's talk about some of the reasons. A long time ago, and I'm talking 40 years now ago, dungeons were constructed with an assumption that they would be built on level, or at least they were described in the rulebook as such. By that I mean that there was a level 1 to a dungeon, and then you'd go deeper to level 2, and so on. And eventually you'd reach the beholder level. The treasure tables were organized thusly as well. Deeper into the dungeon lay richer treasures and more perilous monsters. There are classic modules which really speak to this and leverage it to develop the narrative. I believe that Fort Strategy, which is a component of the Smackdown the Slave Lords adventure path of yore, that's what I call it, is built on that principle. There's an top level of the fortress, which is the castle itself, and then there are the dungeon levels below. And the top level can require certain spells, certain strategies and approaches, perhaps putting on disguises, using fly spells, riding a boat through the moat, or going frogmen style and climbing up the wall. And then as you go deeper into the dungeon and the alert is raised, you're reaching toward a goal, which might be a treasure, it might be rescuing someone, it might be the big bad evil guy, or it might just be clearing out the entirety of the complex. The villains may be more aware of you, but in any case, the terrain can change and require a different posture. You might have to take off your armor because it's so wet down there. You may need to squeeze through tight spaces and go in single file. Better get out those polearms so you can attack over your companion's head. You might need your dungeon delving gear to include things like rope and pitons and lantern oil. Whereas above, you need a wholly different portfolio of stuff. And that stress, that attrition from the first part, those challenges in the first part, and then a second set of ideas and perhaps villains that are aware of your coming and now on alert, that provided a really fun change of tempo as people played in dungeons for a really more extended period. They would have, upwards of 20, 25 encounters and explore maybe 50 or 60 rooms in what they thought of as a dungeon back in those times. More recently, if you want a touchstone for how a dungeon could be structured with levels in this concept in mind, look no further than the Sunless Citadel and the Forge of Fury, which are two now classic and revered modules which kicked off with the release of 3.0 edition and were sort of iconic and built to teach certain concepts of the third edition game and D&D in general. And I think they really speak to why you would do it. The big bad evil guy of Forge of Fury is down below. You can learn more about the big bad things that he did in the area above. You can get whispers of his weaknesses and what treasure awaits you below. You can feel really thrilled that you found the treasure down below, and yet the rest of the adventure module above, the challenge might not be spoiled. If it's a very undead-rich dungeon and you find an undead bane sword, it can be down below in the bottom floor of the dungeon. This sort of gatekeeper effect can create keys and choke points as you are preparing a module ahead of time. It's, and frankly, convenient for the dungeon master to build a dungeon with levels. What's some other reasons that you do this? One of them is simply to kind of tightly knit the dungeon environment and to make it less linear. It's called jacqueing for one of the initial folks to do that to their dungeon. I believe there's a module called Dark Tower, I could be wrong, which is very famous for the number of different ways that rooms can be interconnected, the ways that different encounters can follow or precede one another. And it's great fun, and no two experiences of the dungeon were alike, which increased the replay value of the module, and it let a dungeon master run the module for different parties without getting bored themselves. It was an increased value of the product, and it increased the competitiveness of it, and it was a way for module authors to show off and give it some flair, frankly. In my own experience, one of the things that I have done to create dimension and bigness, to give people an opportunity to use their ranged weapons, to jump down on foes or jump up onto folks, activate their fly spells or climb up columns and scramble, to create filmic experiences out of combat is to have mezzanine balconies. You move into a large area, it's sort of like a courtyard, and there's a balcony, a gallery above, and maybe there's a lot of archers that are going to rain down arrows, or the villain, confronts you and threatens that they will open fire if you do not comply. And thus ensues one of those iconic everybody was kung fu fighting moments. These are some reasons to include verticality. This is why you would do it. All of these take time. That last one about mezzanine balconies and three-dimensional fights, those fights will take longer. Describing the environments or drawing them and making sure everyone is on the same page about the geometry of them, it'll take longer than just saying it's a 10-foot corridor. So adding layers to a dungeon is something which I think should be done with care. It should be done for a reason, be it because there's a logic to it. This could be a dungeon that is a high tower, and each floor is very small. This would also logically be a reason to include an elevator. Is if you are ascending 100 stories and each one has one or two rooms, some of them are burned out or open to the air and are not stories at all, this is a great opportunity to make use of a lift. It could allow backtracking to be more interesting. You name it. Hey, interlude. I've got a couple of cool ideas for how to make elevators fantastic. How to make it more interesting than just, there's an elevator with a button. Idea number one, maybe there's a character, a guardian of the elevator, a mechanical person. They used to be called golems, but I think we're trying to come up with a new word that we can all agree with for that. And this might be the thing that resets the elevator, that winds it up, that operates it. They may have a little bit of a personality, but they're a construct or an outsider, which is bereft of its free will, is just kind of there and exists solely to operate the elevator. They might have some quirks, like they like peppermints. Maybe they'll give you some gossip about who last rode the elevator. Just a cool idea. Just a thought. On the other side of the coin, maybe an evil wizard geased a celestial ox to haul the elevator car up the inclined plane, and like a Sisyphusian task for eternity, she's bound to it. That poor creature. As adopting things out of the dungeon has become pretty popular in 5th edition, and most parties end up with a pet mimic, it could be a real feel-good moment that as the dungeon is cleared, as things are made safe, the party walks out with a happy, freed oxen, broken of her curse, and maybe she spends a lot of time in the village with garlands of flowers around her neck. And It's just a feel-good thing which adds to the fantastic landscape of your Dungeons and Dragons play. Now, there's some other dimensions to elevators, like floors which can only be accessed with a special key, with a special combination of buttons, or perhaps the elevator only works once it's been reset in a nearby room or wound back up. It could be that in order to keep the car held at the floor that you're on, somebody needs to be holding the capstan, else it falls back down, it unwinds to the lowest floor it can. You might need to set the brakes. It could be interesting to have certain button combinations that allow you to freeze and immobilize the car. When does the car unfortunately abandon you? Well, this is the sort of thing that some games that aren't Dungeons and Dragons have ways of handling. Things like the Destiny flip in Star Wars, Fantasy Flight, or Genesis. You're going to have to come up with yourself. I would say maybe a random encounter roll that, indicates a encounter is occurring could instead be the elevator car has abandoned you. Just a way of taking care of that and leaving it on the table and making it something that's anticipated but not necessarily dreaded to the point. We want to make sure that people will use this elevator since we are preparing the dungeon kind of around it being there. This video, like many others on my channel, represents a little bit of a risk, going into swampy details about how elevators work and reckoning with the history of how elevators have always been there, telling certain people who are whining about how elevators are unrealistic that they're wrong and to forget about it. And also expressing sort of my own thoughts about how there are other perspectives that reach beyond simply making the world of the game the most accommodating it can be. I think that you, the viewer, are smart enough to kind of take or leave many of these ideas as you see fit. But thank you for making it to the end. That really means a lot. That means that the algorithm will love this video more. And if you have some questions or some thoughts, if there's a part of this video that you'd like me to develop more, or something that really ground your gears, or really you found impolitic, then by all means leave a dislike or even a comment to explain some of that to me. And I hope you stay tuned for more of this stuff and also more of my content specifically about some role-playing games that I'm very fond of. You can look on the channel and get an idea of what I love most in this hobby. I hope that you're having a better 2021 than we had a 2020. Take care, folks.